Book 2, Chapter 6, Facts and Fairy Tales. The noise and confusion of the plaza had vanished as the thick glass doors slid shut behind them. The doctor was usually pretty busy, but there were other attractions that took precedent tonight, so the trio was alone in the building. There were many doors inside the doctor's office, and David followed Joe into one of them. He saw a dimly lit room beyond the door, and two thickly padded chairs sitting before a small stage with a drawn curtain. They went inside and took their seats. Teddy slid from David's back and stood attentively by his side. David could see there was a screen on the stage in front of them, and on a small panel before them, luminous letters read, "Ask me anything." Joe pressed a button above the words, and the room darkened as the curtain over the small screen opened. It started slowly, but then with a whirl of color and sound, the screen came to life, and David was taken back as holographic images of flailing lights came from the stage and whipped through the space before him. They seemed to come right out of the screen at him. Then he saw a spiral of light that danced in circles, going faster and faster as it grew. He had seen this image of light before. It was the galaxy. As the image swirled around and round, it seemed to close in on itself. And then, from the middle of the chaos, a head sprung forth, spinning as quickly as the milky cluster of stars. It stopped suddenly and smiled at them. This was the face that David had seen outlined in the lights in front of the building. The old, wise Orga face. But this was no Orga. It was Dr. No. "Starving minds! Welcome to Dr. No!" the doctor said excitedly as it bounced around the stage. It was just a head with two white-gloved hands that gestured wildly, punctuating each statement. David realized that this was not a friend of Joe's at all. Was it a game? "This is what fast food for thought is served up 24 hours a day and 40,000 locations nationwide. Ask Dr. No!" the head exclaimed. "There's nothing I don't." David jumped from his seat excitedly. "Tell me where I can find the blue fairy," he demanded. There was a beep, and the big head moved back as if surprised by David. "Question me, you pay the fee. 2 for 5 and get 1 free, the doctor exclaimed, counting off the numbers with upraised fingers. David was perplexed at this response and sat back down. Was it a puzzle? Joe understood, for he had been here before. He leaned over and explained to David. "He means 2 questions cost 5 new bucks, David, with a 3rd question on the house." David did not know "on the house," but he knew that this would cost money. Mommy had given him some money, but he remembered seeing it fall to the dirt at the flesh fair. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out what was left. The crumpled wad of bills was much smaller now. What if he didn't have enough? "That's everything I have left," he said to Joe, who held his hand outstretched. Joe counted the money. 10 new bucks and a 10 copper piece. 7 questions, David, is what this will buy. "That should be enough, shouldn't it?" David asked, concerned by Joe's look. After all, there was only one question that really mattered. But Joe had been through this before and knew the complexities of retrieving information from the good doctor. David was obviously new to all this. He was apparently new to everything. Whoever had kept him hadn't shown him much of the world. Joe felt another strange bit of data running through him as he realized he was going to be responsible for teaching the little mecha. He had no word for this thought. "The doctor's a smooth operator, David," he whispered. "He'll press our limits and make us work, but try we must." Then he put the money into the tray and slid it in. The doctor quickly sprang into motion again. His face was lit up with excitement, and his hands gestured wildly as he spoke. "Greetings, colleagues. Unauthorized factual text or fictional text, first to third person, usual literacy..." Stylized holographic text images of the categories came out of his hands. The colorful words announcing the categories floated around them, filling the room. David suddenly realized why Joe had been so concerned. He was amazed at the amount of information he must sort through to ask a simple question. "Who's who, where's where, or flat fact?" David glanced at Joe, confused. "Flat fact?" he asked. The categories disappeared suddenly. "Thank you for question number 1. The doctor said in response to David's words. "Flat fact is a term..." "That shouldn't count," David said to the doctor angrily, as he continued talking. He turned to Joe for help. "That wasn't my question," he said with a plea in his eyes. Joe leaned close and whispered, "You must take care not to raise your voice at the end of the sentence, David, or he'll think you're asking him a question," he explained. David was glad Joe was here to explain things, or he may have already used his questions up. He also realized that the doctor was very clever. He'd have to be careful. The doctor noticed the two were talking but couldn't understand them. "You're mumbling," he said as he finished answering the question. The two mechas once again paid him their attention. "Flat fact," Joe said plainly, announcing a category of their interest. Then he looked at David. "You have 6 more questions," the doctor announced, waiting with the fingers of his holographic hands pressed together. David started cautiously. He had to ask the question right this time. "Where is Blue Fairy?" he asked slowly. "In the garden," the doctor announced happily. His holographic hand was suddenly filled with a bouquet of colorful flowers. "Vascosalis Blue Fairy blooms twice annually with bright blue flowers on a branched inflorescence. A hybrid between Ascomena Arnold. Now you have 5 more questions," he said, his hands as suddenly empty as the flowers had appeared. David thought. "Who is Blue Fairy?" he asked when the question occurred to him. "Are you sad, lonely?" the doctor inquired, his voice now warm and understanding. "Blue Fairy Escort Service will find a mate for you. Call us. We're in your Cyberpater's guide." David was not sure at all what that meant, but he knew it was not his Blue Fairy. Joe smiled, recognizing the advertisement. His little friend was going to have to be more careful in his questioning. "You have 4 more questions," the doctor happily informed them. David could not be sure, but he wondered if the machine was enjoying this. The doctor was smiling patiently again, his floating head propped against his floating hands as he waited for the next round of inquiry. David was closer to the truth than he knew. To the doctor, everything was a game. "Joe," David beckoned. Joe leaned across the seats, and the boy mecha whispered to him, "Try fairy tale." "New category," Joe said, sitting upright. The room filled again with the colorful text. "A fairy's tale," Joe said. "No," David whispered urgently. He didn't want to get anything else wrong. They were running out of questions. "It's fairy tale," he corrected. "No," Joe repeated to the doctor. The machine beeped as he recalculated his category. "Fairy tale," Joe said. The floating words disappeared again, and the doctor's eyes looked back to David. He understood that the little one seemed to be asking all the questions. David waited a long moment before asking, "What is Blue Fairy?" he inquired finally, when he felt sure it was the correct wording. "Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi," the doctor said, and he began to recite the tale. "At this signal, there was a rustling as a flapping of wings, and a large falcon flew to the windowsill." The doctor continued, but David had already heard the story. His mind was elsewhere. It was on the little holographic images that floated through the room. There was one that had to be little Pinocchio, and another that looked like Geppetto, his father, and there was his friend Jiminy, the cricket, and then... David's missing heart would have jumped, for there she was. "That's her," he said in awed reverence, as the image of a winged fairy dressed in blue floated through the room. He reached out as she passed and tried to stop her, but she slipped right through his hands and was headed back towards the stage with the others. Where was she going? He had to stop her. He needed her help. Who had lived in the wood for more than 1,000... The doctor stopped abruptly as the little one jumped up on the stage, pursuing the retreating holographs. Joe was amazed to see David jump up on the stage, trying to grab the retreating fairy. "Check that!" Very young. Very silly. He jumped up quickly and hoisted David down from the stage. The doctor waited patiently. This wasn't the first child he'd seen overreact to something he'd shown. "That's her! That's her!" David chanted excitedly, as Joel pulled him down from the stage and set him back in his chair. "It was only an example of her, David, just a representation," Joe explained patiently. The boy had so much to learn about living in Rouge. It would take some time for him. "But I think we're getting closer," Joe added with a wink. The doctor saw the little one was now under control and began reciting the story again. He thought it best to keep the images to himself this time. But there was a reason David hadn't chosen fairy tale in the first round of questions. He leaned close to Joe and whispered urgently, "If a fairy tale is real, then wouldn't it be a fact? A flat fact?" Joe understood immediately. "Say no more," he cautioned. He knew the doctor would love for them to use all our questions and have to pay for more. He also realized that David probably did not understand this. He would explain later. "New category, please," Joe announced, with a twinkle in his eye. He had an idea for the doctor. The room filled with the glowing words again, and Joe surveyed them slowly. Then he knew what to do. Joe found the banners he was looking for and indicated them both. "Combine fact and fairy tale," he said. The doctor flipped his head around as he juggled the categories. He wondered what the two were up to. He had an idea what it was, but he'd be patient. It was only a game after all. "Now, David," Joe said, "ask again." David stood, and the doctor's floating head shifted so now it was looking at him. Its eyes seemed to regard him appraisingly. He had to do this right. They were almost out of questions. They had no more money. They were close, so close. How can the blue fairy make a... He paused there. He had to say it, although he really didn't want to. Robot into a real live boy. The doctor had an idea that this was coming. It was not part of his regular programming. It was a special, secret instruction. He folded his head back into the system and let other agencies take over. The room suddenly went dark after Dr. No's head vanished from the stage. There was a great low hum that came from all around them. And then bright flashes of light struck through the darkness repeatedly. Unconsciously, David reached out and took Joe's hand. Joe received his hand automatically. The flashing lights finally stopped. It was silent now. Then words suddenly appeared scrolling up the screen on the stage, and a gentle voice came from the walls around them. It said, "Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand." David was stunned by what he saw. What had they chanced upon? He stared at the screen in amazement as the words scrolled by. "Your quest will be perilous, yet the reward is beyond price." In his book, How Can a Robot Become Human?, Professor Alan Hobby writes of the power that will transform Mecha into Orga. Then the screen was dark again, and the voice was gone. David waited. Joe sat quietly, not believing what he'd just witnessed. How could this be? "Will you tell me how to find her?" David asked the voice. Something he was not aware of recorded his voice patterns. And then the voice answered. "Discovery is quite possible," the voice said. "Our blue fairy does exist, in one place, and in one place only." David was afraid to even move lest he missed this vital information. "At the end of the world, where the lions weep, here is the place where dreams are born." David was ecstatic. He knew where she was now. At the end of the world, where the lions weep. But what was this place? He did not see the grim look that had crept into Joe's face. "Many a mecha has gone to the end of the world," Joe said slowly, "never to come back." He fixed David with a warning glance. "That is why they call the end of the world Manhattan," he said. "And that is why we must go there," David said excitedly. He was ready to be real now. He had come so far in order to do so, gone through so much. In the composite of his personality, he was perhaps already a boy. And like a boy, there was no danger that would dissuade him appropriately from his desires. "Teddy, we found her," he informed his little friend as he lifted him from the seat. "I know, David. I saw the message," Teddy responded. He'd never heard of the Blue Fairy outside of a storybook, and knew nothing of Manhattan. He felt something was wrong with this message, and he'd been feeling that same way about Rouge City ever since they'd arrived. But David was safe, and there was no immediate trouble he needed to avoid. So Teddy accepted the situation for now. David picked him up quickly, and they were on the move again. He walked with a determined strut out of the booth and into the main hall. It was quiet. Just a swish of David's pant legs and a quick pat of his shoes on the floor. All the Orga were busy chasing other bits of information in the plaza and in the great buildings that lined the walkways. Joe sat watching David strut down the hallway. The boy hadn't even waited for him, and after all he had done to bring him here. If not for him, well, David might still be roaming the dark forest, or getting beat up by some Orga boys at the side of the road. And where was he going, after all? To Manhattan? To the end of the world? The place where Mecha go to never return? David had no idea what that place was like. There could be things worse than the flesh fair there. Joe realized that David was young. A boy, really. Just like an Orga boy. He was inexperienced and needed someone to protect him, to care for him, to keep him from trouble. Manhattan was more than just trouble. It was more than just bad trouble. He jumped up and rushed to the main room. "Wait!" he called to David, who was quickly stepping towards the door. David turned and saw Joe approaching. There was something urgent in his face. He'd not known Joe could make such an Orga-like expression. Joe walked around David and blocked his passage to the exit. "What if the blue fairy isn't real at all, David?" he asked. David's brow creased in concern at the question. What was Joe saying? Hadn't he been listening? But indeed, Joe had been listening. "What if she's magic?" Joe continued, moving closer to the boy, who backed away, not understanding Joe's apparent anger. "The supernatural is the hidden web that unites the universe, David. Only Orga believe what cannot be seen or measured. It is that oddness which separates our species." Joe knew the boy was listening now. His eyes were wide with uncertainty, perhaps fear. Inside, he knew it was bad to do this, but it was for David's benefit. It was for his own good. The fear would protect him. "Have you considered that, David?" But David did not respond. Joe backed the boy farther into the room. "Or what if the blue fairy is an electronic parasite that has risen to haunt the minds of artificial intelligence?" he queried. Joe knew that those who kept David, this Mommy and Henry, had probably not warned him of viruses. They'd not really cared for him the way that they should have. He had to make David understand this. Make him understand what Orga really were. Make him understand that. "They hate us, David," he said, and his voice was strange even to him. "The humans, they hate us. They'll stop at nothing." David did not understand these thoughts that came from his new friend. He was lost as he tried to process them. Why would the blue fairy exist in a story if she were not real? Dr. No had been real, and they had seen the representation of the blue fairy there. Joe said that Orga hate them, but didn't Orga save them from the flesh fair? Orga were not as one. They were different. David knew this. "My mommy doesn't hate me," he started, and took a cautious step forward. "Because I'm special, and what had the man steward said? Unique. Yes, that's what it was." He took another step forward, and Joe stepped back. "Because there's never been anyone like me before, ever." He wasn't afraid anymore. "Mommy loves Martin because he's real, and when I'm real, Mommy's going to read to me, and tuck me into my bed, and sing to me, and listen to what I say, and she will hold me, and cuddle me, and tell me every day 100 times a day that she loves me." David stopped then, his face beaming triumphantly. Joe looked away from the innocent's prideful folly. "They will crush him, this little one," he thought. "They will break him and throw him out like so much scrap metal." Joe had seen these Orga like they really were. He knew things about them. Somewhere deep in his processor, he knew things about the Orga. He'd never brought these thoughts to the surface before. It had never been necessary. Before tonight, there had only been the call to duty, the call of sex and Orga pleasures. But things were different now. "She loves what you do for her, David, as my customers love what it is I do for them," he explained slowly. He had to get his point across if he cared at all for the little one. "But she does not love you. She cannot love you." He knew this would hurt, but apart from damage alerts, Joe didn't know what hurt was. Yet, "You are neither flesh or blood, David. You are not a dog or a cat or a canary, or even a fish. A rat in a cage would receive more of their love than you. You were designed and built specific just like the rest of us, and you were alone now only because they tired of you, or replaced you with a younger or better model, or were displeased with something you said or broke. They made us too smart, too quick, and too many. We are suffering for the mistakes they made, because when the end comes, and all they have built and dreamed of is washed away, all that will be left is us. And that's why they hate us. And that's why you must stay here." Joe reached out to his friend. "With me." David felt a new sadness. He had not understood all the things that Joe had said, but Joe was right about one thing. David was built specific. He was made to be young, and like the young, all that moved his heart were dreams and beautiful things. And love. He was to think and feel things that no mech had ever thought or felt before. He had a motivation as strong as any Orga who had ever moved a mountain to reach a plateau. David wasn't sad because Joe had taught him something he didn't want to learn. His sadness was because he must clearly go on without him. "Goodbye, Joe," he said softly, and walked to the door and outside, where his sadness quickly gave way to new resolve.